Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now at the podium. He's there at Congress. He's received a standing ovation there from members of Congress, even though some lawmakers are boycotting his speech in response to Israel's war on Gaza. And the last time the Prime Minister addressed Congress was in March 2015. He's here at a time when Israel's war on Gaza is about to enter its 10th month, and more than 39,000 Palestinians have been killed now in Gaza. This is a speech that will be watched very carefully beyond Congress, beyond Washington. And let's see what Prime Minister Netanyahu has to say. And he was invited actually by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. A standing ovation there for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on his three-day visit here to Washington, D.C. And many empty seats is something that we've been discussing. The most notable empty seat is by Vice President Kamala Harris, who is not attending this, and also many senators.
I now have the high privilege and
let's listen in
presenting to you His Excellency
as Prime Minister
Netanyahu, Prime Minister
takes
of Israel.
The podium.
Thank you. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, Senator Ben Cardin, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Senators, members of Congress, distinguished guests. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for giving me the profound honor of addressing this great citadel of democracy for the fourth time. We meet today at a crossroads of history. Our world is in upheaval. In the Middle East, Iran's axis of terror confronts America, Israel, and our Arab friends. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization. It's a clash between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together. Because when we stand together, something very simple happens. We win, they lose. And my friends, I came to assure you today of one thing: we will win. Ladies and gentlemen, like December 7th, 1941, and September 11th, 2001, October 7th is a day that will forever live in infamy. It was the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. It began as a perfect day, not a cloud in the sky. Thousands of young Israelis were celebrating at an outdoor music festival. And suddenly, at 6:29 a.m., as children were still sleeping soundly in their beds in the towns and kibbutzim next to Gaza, suddenly heaven turned into hell. 3,000 Hamas terrorists stormed into Israel. They butchered 1,200 people from 41 countries, including 39 Americans. Proportionately, compared to our population size, that's like 20 9/11s in one day. And these monsters, they raped women, they beheaded men, they burnt babies alive, they killed parents in front of their children, and children in front of their parents. They dragged 255 people, both living and dead, into the dark dungeons of Gaza. Israel has already brought home 135 of these hostages, including 7 who were freed in daring rescue operations.
There to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel giving his opening remarks there to Congress. He's made many statements, and almost every single sentence received by a rapturous applause. Meanwhile, outside Congress, there are thousands of people protesting, and also there are many lawmakers who have chosen to boycott Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech. Let's just get a sense of what's happening outside the US Congress and speak to Craig Boswell. Craig, how is the mood now that Prime Minister Netanyahu has started his speech to Congress?
Look, the things that are being said certainly not going to sit well with demonstrators and protesters outside of the U.S. Capitol. They have moved from where we are standing here at the Shut It Down for Palestine stage. They have begun marching around the city and close as they can get to the Capitol so that Benjamin Netanyahu can hear their voices and the things that they are saying in response, almost in real time, to what Benjamin Netanyahu is saying inside the congressional, this joint meeting of Congress. And I don't know if you've heard or can hear these sirens that are going by. Ever since Benjamin Netanyahu took the stage to the standing ovation, there has been a steady stream of police cars just screaming by here on 7th Street. I can't turn the camera around to kind of show you what's in front of me, but there is just a line of dump trucks blocking this road, dump trucks beyond that blocking the road, and of course the stage several blocks up the road. The security perimeter around the U.S. Capitol is massive. It is concrete barriers that are 8-foot high, steel fencing around the Capitol. Extra 200 New York police have been sworn in to help Capitol Police. One of the things that demonstrators are priding themselves in today is the fact that they're roving around and shutting down intersections. It's the Shut It Down for Palestine, and they go to intersections, shut it down, and when the police swoop in, they disperse. Okay. And they move on to other locations, and they'll announce the streets here at this stage. But yeah, jump in anytime one. Just one more thing, they're going to be now moving this kind of the epicenter over to the National Mall, where much
Craig,
of the
we're going to come back to you
is going to continue well into the night
shortly.
And tomorrow.
Thank you. Craig, we'll come back to you shortly as those protests continue outside the Capitol. Let's go back and listen to what Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying.
With her mother and Eliyahu's son. The entire family was taken hostage. 2 beautiful red-haired children taken hostage. What monsters. And with us also is Iris Chaim, whose son, Yotam, bravely escaped Hamas captivity with 2 other Israelis, and tragically they were killed making their way back to our lines. We have with us also the families of American hostages. They're here. The pain these families have endured is beyond words. I met with them again yesterday, and I promised them this: I will not rest until all their loved ones are home, all of them.
To our viewers who've just joined us, we're listening there to Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is making an address to Congress. Let's just get some analysis on what's been said right now and speak to political analyst Sami Al-Arian, who's the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. Sami, how do you think the remarks made by Prime Minister Netanyahu will be watched and analysed beyond Washington?
Well, so far, what I've witnessed is just Hollywood. It's just pure theater with a third-rate actor, basically. He's trying to bring a narrative that is totally a false and fake narrative. He's talking about the victims, the Israeli victims, on October 7th being 29 of 9/11s, while he actually killed, if I'm going to use his logic, almost 8 million Americans since. When you talk about almost 50,000 Palestinians dead, with those who have lost their lives or under the rubble, and about 22 million Palestinians, Americans injured, which is equivalent to about 121,000 in Gaza. So what is he talking about? I mean, he's the war criminal. He's the one who's insisting in this war of extermination against the Palestinians, a genocide, ethnic cleansing. And when you look also at the kind of performance he's doing, is trying to imitate what the Americans usually do, American presidents, when they address Congress. And that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to use emotions, but no one, I think, is really taking him seriously, knowing the person that he is. Let's note also that he is addressing Congress for the fourth time. That shows the complicit nature of this Congress. There is no other foreign leader ever in the history of the United States that addressed Congress 4 times. Churchill addressed it 3 times. And here we have a war criminal being advanced by U.S. Congress as being someone who is championing democracy and human rights. And he is basically promising total victory, a victory that he's unable to achieve after 10 months of genocide.
Sami, do stay where you are. We'll be back with you for more analysis. Sami Al-Arian, Director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. For now, thank you very much indeed. All right, let's go to John Brain, our reporter who joins us from the US Capitol. And John, when you were speaking to your guest earlier, you mentioned how provocative Benjamin Netanyahu's visit is right now. Tell us more about that point.
Well, I guess the point we were making is that this is such a febrile time for the Israeli Prime Minister to be here when he is such a polarizing figure. And we've seen ever since October the 7th a gradual ramping up of discontent about what's happening in Gaza here in America. And Gaza is not something that's ever been really a big issue for the US before. It's very much a domestic focused nation, not a lot of attention paid to that part of the world. So there have been protests in the streets, there's been an escalation of those protests, and it has had political consequences because key marginal swing states that will determine the election in November have been affected by these protests. States where Joe Biden won very narrowly in 2020 and which he needs to win again, or rather Kamala Harris or whoever the Democratic nominee turns out to be ultimately, needs to win in 2024. So it's very notable that Kamala Harris is one of the people who is not attending this speech. She is trying to put some daylight between herself and Joe Biden to send a message that she doesn't quite agree with the Biden administration's policy of full support for Israel in Gaza. She has said as much on a couple of occasions, particularly on the issue of humanitarian aid, which she's been very exercised about, and she called for a ceasefire much earlier than some of her colleagues did. So all these things always have to be seen through the prism of domestic politics as much as they are seen through US foreign policy. But as we know, Joe Biden has been trying very hard to bring about a ceasefire. And the fact that he is no longer going to be running for re-election means he is able to devote his efforts more to this now. He said that one of his aims before leaving office is to get peace in Gaza. All presidents are concerned about their legacy. In terms of foreign policy, Biden's legacy at the moment will be that chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. So if he can secure a ceasefire and some sort of plan beyond the end of the war, that would certainly be seen by him and many others as a considerable legacy. So he'll obviously be meeting with Netanyahu on Thursday. It'll be interesting to hear what they have to say. I doubt we'll get the full account of that conversation, because Biden, as we know, has run out of patience with Netanyahu, someone he's known for decades and has counted as a friend. The war has strained their relationship, so Biden will be putting pressure on Netanyahu again to help him get a ceasefire organized and get this war finally ended.
And just on that point of the strained relationship between the US administration right now and Prime Minister Netanyahu, talk to us about how that's changed over the past 10 months during Israel's war on Gaza, and how this visit impacts what Netanyahu will do with the ceasefire and when he returns.
Well, it's changed in the sense, as I say, things have escalated. I mean, it's always been an article of faith in the US that this country supports Israel. It was the first nation to recognize the state of Israel, and support has been pretty rock solid ever since then. As we know, more than $3 billion worth of aid goes to Israel every year from the US. More has been given since the war began. But that support, which once would have had full support across the nation, is beginning to fracture. And certainly there's a generational divide, I would say. The people we're seeing on the streets, the pro-Palestinians, are more radicalized, younger people who don't share the same faith in Israel that their the next generation up does. I mean, certainly in Congress, which tends to have a fairly high age profile, they've grown up with this idea that Israel is America's closest ally and should always be supported. And we're seeing the younger lawmakers are beginning to challenge that, and certainly younger elements of the population who do appear to have been radicalized and politicized by what has happened. So Netanyahu, he's not going to be too concerned about those elements. He wants to speak directly to whoever's in power, whether that's Kamala Harris, whether that's Donald Trump. Of course, he's going to meet Donald Trump on Friday, and I don't think it'll be any secret to say that Netanyahu, on balance, would certainly prefer to see Donald Trump back in the White House. The two had a very strong working relationship during the first Trump administration. Trump moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem at Israel's request. He has no truck with a two-state solution. And on a more positive note, of course, he orchestrated the Abraham Accords, getting agreements between Israel and some of the Middle Eastern states. So Netanyahu and Trump, although their relationship also went into decline after Trump left office for various reasons, that would probably be in Netanyahu's best interest. But then, of course, will Netanyahu even be in office by the time the American election comes around? That's got to be in doubt as well.
Absolutely, that's a really important question. John, for now, thank you very much indeed. John Braid, live there from Washington, D.C. All right, let's take you to our Istanbul studios and speak to TRT World's former Gaza reporter and political analyst, Nizar Sadawi. Nizar, as you watch Israel's Prime Minister here deliver this speech in Congress, and as we've heard, this is his fourth time addressing Congress, what goes through your mind and your reaction to what he's said so far?
I do believe that every Palestinian now is trying to watch the news, even though they don't have electricity or internet, but they're wondering what will happen if this ceasefire proposal that is still presumably on the table doesn't work. What happens? Will that mean that it's going to have to wait for until the next presidential elections in the USA? What happens if Biden doesn't really enforce this ceasefire? Is Benjamin Netanyahu really going to talk about this? Or maybe not. Maybe he will address it. Maybe he won't. It depends on what happens there. But for all we know, Palestinians are looking at the United States government as complicit, as partners with Israel. They know they have been involved with whatever is happening in Gaza, what is still happening, the ongoing war, the continued support, the continued military aid, $3.8 billion of aid annually going from the U.S. to Israel. That definitely means that they are partners. They're not just allies. This isn't what the U.S. would do with any other ally, for example. And this proposal came from the U.S. President Biden, who's about to leave now. It's quite clear that for Palestinians, whether it's Kamala Harris, whether it's Donald Trump, it's going to be the same. But what does make a change, what could actually change the situation, is the pressure that has been mounting on the Prime Minister Netanyahu, on the Israeli Prime Minister, whether from the international community, from Israel itself, or even, by the way, from the United States. I do believe this is part of the reason why he's being there. I mean, one of the recent polls said that 52% of Americans are actually calling their government to halt sending weapons to Israel because of what's happening in Gaza, because of the ongoing attacks. So Benjamin Netanyahu has a direct interest in showing their alliance and receive some sort of encouragement from the U.S. And again, like your guest has been saying, this is the first time in history, a political figure is invited and addresses the Congress for the fourth time. This hasn't happened before. And it gives the message that the U.S. is still adamant to continue the support to the Israeli government, whether Netanyahu or anyone else, by the way, because even if he doesn't stay in power, even if there is a new prime minister in Israel because of these issues that, domestic problems inside Israel politically, it doesn't mean that the U.S. will change its course. It doesn't mean that there will be a new U.S. policy in terms of military aid. But we do know that a time has come when this ongoing war in Gaza needs to stop, and the U.S. needs to play a key role in this. And that's why Palestinians are hoping that this time something will change, because again, I repeat, if that doesn't happen now, if it doesn't happen these days, the next few days will be critical, definitely, especially after he meets Donald Trump, especially after this delegation finishes the talks in Doha and in Cairo. If there is no ceasefire, then that means another 3 months at least of suffering, more suffering for Palestinians.
Absolutely. And Nizar, we heard some media reports saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to present the so-called day after Gaza war plan in his speech to US Congress. I don't know if he's said it right now yet, but what's been said, or what do you expect him to say with regards to that?
Well, he's definitely going to talk about whether Hamas will be involved or not. This has been a key issue here for Benjamin Netanyahu and for Israelis in general. The post-war Gaza, how would Gaza, or what would Gaza look like after the war? He has been really hung up on this. It's not even recent. He has always talked about this implicitly. But to be honest, Palestinians are still convinced, and they're not going to change their mind on this. They're never going to change their decision that this is an internal Palestinian issue. And perhaps that's actually one of the main reasons we have seen these reconciliation talks and, Fatah and Hamas, the main two rivals, signing on a new agreement in China yesterday and the day before. This is actually significant. Palestinians are aware of this. The factions, including, of course, Hamas, are definitely aware that if they don't form a legit unity government that could be recognized from the international community, including, of course, the United States, then it's going to be difficult. And Benjamin Netanyahu will go for his original plan, which is technically to stay in control of Gaza somehow, some way or another. And actually, we've seen these statements coming from Israel Katz, the foreign minister of Israel, talking about how they should keep their security by staying in Gaza. He's saying that if the Palestinian Authority makes this deal with Hamas, they will just stand from afar and watch Hamas staying in control in Gaza, and this cannot be accepted by Israel. He's technically saying that a unity government, a Palestinian coalition, for example, will not be accepted from Israel. But I do not believe that they can actually enforce this idea. I think the international community, even the United States government and the new president, whether that's Trump or Harris or anyone else, will definitely be able to use leverage and force Israel to accept this idea. And Israel is fully aware of this, but they need assurances that Hamas will not be alone, at least. And this is actually, according to our sources, it's still being discussed behind closed doors, whether in Cairo or in Doha. This is a main interest, not just for Israel, by the way, but also for other regional powers, including the lead mediators, Qatar and Egypt.
Nizar Hadawi, thank you so much, our former Gaza correspondent who's joining us now from our Istanbul studios. For now, thank you. Thank you for those first-hand thoughts and analysis. Nizar, thank you. All right, let's go to Sami Alarian, who's the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. And Sami, you are originally from Palestine. You've spent a lot of time in the US. As you see the protests on the streets of Washington, also Tel Aviv, how do you think that pressure could sway anything? As John Brain mentioned, this before in the US was very much a domestic issue, but we're seeing changes in swing states like Michigan, and also just so many, tens of thousands of people protesting in Washington right now, and even some US lawmakers boycotting Netanyahu's speech in Congress.
Indeed, about 30% of the Democrats are boycotting, and you have tens of thousands of people who have been marching since last October. And we've seen last spring how many campuses around the country have erupted also in trying to force the political elites in the country to change course, particularly the White House, but it hasn't come to a good conclusion so far. And I think social unrest is one of the keys, by the way, that determine elections. I mean, it hasn't happened since Vietnam, since then the Iraq War. So it has the potential actually to derail the current administration from having a term, a presidential term, even after Biden had withdrawn. So the question is, will we going again to see these demonstrations on campuses? That depends, of course, whether the war would continue or not. If it's up to Netanyahu, he wants to continue it in eternity. He doesn't have any plan for ending this war. His political future depends on it. He's going to be certainly called to his policies as well as his action on that day would be called into question, because it was his failure to stop that attack. So certainly he would be condemned for it. But more importantly, he is under several indictments for corruption in which he is threatened with prison sentences. A lot of people believe that he would be convicted, and therefore he is in no hurry to end this war for personal reasons, in addition to his ideological bent.
Sami, as we look at these pictures of the lawmakers there in Congress, just constantly, as he delivers his remarks, they stand up and they clap for him, clearly supporting what he is saying. And we are in such a time of transition right now. Why are we seeing so much support 10 months in And could this change with Kamala Harris? And what do you expect also if there is a possible Donald Trump re-election?
I mean, there are many reasons, some geostrategic and some, of course, are internal reasons and much for political reasons. We know that what we're witnessing today are stooges, puppies. These U.S. congressmen and senators have been in the pockets, many of them have been in the pockets of the Israeli lobby. That's not what I say. That's what experts say. Somebody like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer wrote a book about it. It's called The Israel Lobby, in which they talk in details about the impact of the Israel lobby on U.S. politicians, particularly when it comes to Israel and Israeli aid. We have seen several U.S. presidents in the past trying to change course in terms of policies, but they have always been faced with this Israel rock, with this pro-Israel lobby that always try to put Israel's interest in front of the U.S. interest. Unfortunately, they have been successful. They have been very successful with many politicians. But today we also saw, the courage of many politicians, almost 80 senators and congressmen, all Democrat and one Republican, I should say also, Mr. Massey from Kentucky. They refused to bow to the Israeli lobby and attend this speech by a war criminal, by somebody who's been at the cusp of being called into question by the International Criminal Court for his not only policies, but for his complicity in killing tens of thousands of children, women, innocent people, and destroying the lives of almost 120,000 people, some of them for life in terms of maiming them, in addition to the total destruction of Gaza. This is a war criminal in action. We haven't seen in the history of mankind such a Holocaust, really Holocaust. And many Jewish friends and many Jewish people actually they object to this, but that's what we're witnessing today. I mean, it's what's good for the gander, for the goose is good for the gander. If they think that Holocaust only happens to the Jewish people, that's ethnocentric, very myopic vision and very myopic opinion. What we have here is Palestinians are being ethnically cleansed. A genocide is being committed. I have witnessed also a Jewish doctor who went to Gaza for 2 weeks in May, and he came shocked with what he had seen. He said, I've never seen, and I've been in 30 years of practice to 40 different missions around the world. I've never seen once toddlers being shot at with snipers, not with one bullet that may have gone straight, but with 2 bullets, one to the head and one to the chest. This is a witness, an eyewitness, who is also happened to be Jewish, and he is a medical doctor, and he examined dozens of children, and he said these children were not just in the crossfires, they were targeted. We're talking about a criminal army. Mr. Netanyahu now before Congress is talking about the bravery and the courage of the Israeli soldiers. But what he's not talking about, that these Israeli soldiers are nothing but war criminals. They haven't been able to achieve any of his military objectives. They have failed miserably, except for killing children, women, and innocent people.
Sami El-Arian, for now, thank you very much indeed joining us there from Istanbul. We'll be back with you shortly. For now, thanks for your analysis. All right, let's go to Washington, D.C., to our reporter there, John Brain. John, we've been watching the images there, the constant applause for Prime Minister Netanyahu as he addresses Congress for the 4th time. Just summarise what he's been saying so far for us.
Well, he's painting this in terms of civilization versus barbarism, as he describes it. And what he's doing is making sure that the lawmakers make the analogy that they've got a common enemy in Iran. He's talking about Iran's axis of terrorism because, of course, Iran is known to have these proxies such as Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen. So he's really making the point to the lawmakers that it's in America's interest as much as in Israel's interest to counter these sorts of threats. He's said a lot about anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and how these protesters, in his words, are Iran's useful idiots. A lot of support, obviously, from the chamber. He's getting applause pretty much from every line of address he makes. He had a standing ovation as he walked in. Don't necessarily see this, though, in terms of support for Netanyahu. This is really a symbolic support for Israel. It's really in the DNA of the US Congress to support Israel. America was the first country to recognize Israel as a nation, and that support has always been steadfast. It doesn't mean that there's not criticism of Netanyahu personally and more specifically his policies towards Gaza. But certainly the vast majority of lawmakers want to make it clear that they have not abandoned Israel, that they still support Israel, which in their view is a beacon of democracy in the Middle East, and that support they're clearly saying will continue. More significant perhaps than the address to the lawmakers, though, will be the meeting with Joe Biden on Thursday, when behind closed doors they'll discuss how to bring about a ceasefire to end the war on Gaza. And as we've been saying, Joe Biden no longer has the pressures of running for re-election. He can devote himself to this cause. He wants a ceasefire to be part of his legacy, and he's going to be putting a lot of pressure on Netanyahu to help him achieve that at that meeting. There'll be a separate meeting with Kamala Harris. Very notable that she's not here. As Vice President, she would normally be expected to be the one who presides over an occasion like this. She said she had a previous engagement, but of course, under normal circumstances, you would expect a Vice President to cancel any other engagements and to welcome the Israeli leader into the Congress and introduce him formally. So that's an indication of where she stands on the Israel-Gaza conflict. She's certainly not as hardline or quite as supportive as Biden of Israel. That could be obviously deliberately political now that she's running for election, though I don't think she would have attended anyway. But certainly she's sending out a message that her policies, if she becomes president, will not be quite as supportive as Israel as the current administration has been.
And just on that point, that her policies, if Kamala Harris becomes president of the US, they'll be different to President Biden's. How does that work with that point you've just made, John, that it is in the DNA of America to support Israel? Like, what really can change, despite the change in leadership, when we know there's that constant $3 billion aid to the US?
I don't think there'll be any question of stopping that aid. It won't be a situation of no longer supporting Israel, but it will be a case of not supporting Israel's current policies, particularly, of course, in Gaza. So you'll see a shift in emphasis, one would imagine, if Kamala Harris gets into the White House. She'll obviously appoint her own team of foreign experts and analysis. So we'll see much more pressure. Again, this is speculation, but we imagine, bearing in mind the comments she's made in the past and the fact she hasn't turned up to this event, you can imagine that there would be much greater pressure on the Israelis in terms of humanitarian supplies, in terms of bringing about an end to the conflict, if it hasn't already ended by then, of course. And there would be obviously that lever of being able to do what Biden did, which was to suspend one of the arms shipments. He cancelled a delivery, or suspended a delivery of 2,000-pound bombs, which he feared could be used in Rafah. I think you would probably see more suggestions of delays such as that. But again, as we've been saying, Netanyahu might not be the Israeli leader by the time January comes round and there's a new administration, a new president in the White House. Things could be very different. It's a long time. It's a few months away. So even if Kamala Harris has very strong opinions, very strong ideas of what she wants to do, it's going to be a long time before she gets that chance to implement them.
John, for now, thank you very much indeed. And just a reminder to our viewers, if you've just joined us, we're watching via Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu deliver a speech to a joint session of Congress there in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Capitol building. Let's take you to Gaza to see what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's army is doing on the ground in Gaza while he is there in the U.S. Congress delivering that speech. What exactly is he doing, Ashraf?
Well, Israeli military continues to kill and maim Palestinians as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu holds his speeches in Washington, D.C. Just not too long ago, an Israeli tank shell hit an apartment in the northern parts of Rafah, killing 3 people, including 2 children. Over the last few hours, some 24 people were killed, mainly in Khan Yunis, in the eastern parts of Khan Yunis, while at least 6 more people were killed in the northern Gaza Strip town of Beit Lahia. This as Israeli attacks continue all over the Gaza Strip, but mainly concentrating on the eastern parts of Khan Yunis, where more than 150,000 people were displaced since Monday morning after being ordered to evacuate under Israeli tank and artillery fire. Back to you.
Ashraf, for the people of Gaza, as they follow, as Nizar was saying, many of them will be trying to watch and hear what Netanyahu is saying, even though there are so many challenges with electricity right now. But what exactly is the hope? Of course, I understand that the ceasefire talks to progress, but tell us more about their hopes right now.
I think most people here have lost hope of any chances for ceasefire as long as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues as Prime Minister of Israel, because every time a ceasefire, comes close to fruition or any, positive things come out, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu torpedoes these efforts by the mediators and launches a major attack. Just before heading to the United States, he launched the attack on eastern Khan Yunis. Back in early May, when Hamas accepted the terms of the ceasefire, he responded by launching a major invasion of Rafah and almost totally destroyed the southernmost city, where more than 1.3 million people were taken shelter, and they had to be displaced, similar to what happened in Khan Yunis.
Ashraf, Shannon, thank you so much. Live for us there in Gaza. Do stay safe for us. All right, let's take you to occupied East Jerusalem and speak to Mohammed Al-Qasim. Mohammed, just update us on what's happening also in Tel Aviv. We understand there, and we see right now on our screens the protests that are happening there. And also tell us, because you cover this so closely every week, how the families of the hostages will be viewing and listening to Netanyahu's remarks right now. And of course, we know so many of them have said the timing is not right. Do not go to the US when there is no deal to get back their captives.
Indeed, Maria, that's exactly what they're saying. I'm actually in Tel Aviv this evening covering one of the many protests that are taking place across Israel in protest of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech in Congress. While he was speaking, still in fact speaking, the families of the relatives in Gaza and many of their supporters who came out in solidarity with them, they were chanting shame, shame, while Netanyahu was speaking. Also, they were saying akhshaf, which means in Hebrew now. They want him to step down. They want fresh elections, and also they are demanding that he signs a deal, that he announces that a deal is about to be signed with Hamas to secure the release of the Israeli captives in Gaza, but also to bring about an end to the brutal Israeli war in the Gaza Strip. So many misinformation, Maria, has been given during this speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he knows who he's talking to. This is a much friendlier audience than he has back in Israel, back here in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, where he has been harshly criticized for his mismanagement of the war. Netanyahu said during his speech that October 7th was not a day, was a heroic day and day of victory for Israelis. But that was not the case. It was a day of defeat. It was a day when the state of Israel collapsed, when the army actually disappeared for hours before they came to the defense of the Israelis in southern Israel. So also, he spoke about how the world was warning of Israel invasion of Rafah, and he was there last week, he said, and he spoke to one of the Israeli commanders on the ground, and he asked him, he said, how many Hamas members you've killed? And he gave him an exact number, 1,203, while when he asked him how many civilians were killed, he only listed a dozen, and that was by mistake. And that is absolutely inaccurate, untrue. It's a blatant lie by Prime Minister Netanyahu to tell the U.S. Congress, while we know that the number of Palestinian casualties is about to reach 40,000. More than half of those are children and women, and that's by admission of the U.S., that's by admission of the United Nations and many other non-governmental organizations across the world. He attacked the ICC, he attacked the ICJ, and that was not received well among those protesters who came out today to send a clear message to Netanyahu, but also to the Americans, that they should not have made this invitation to Netanyahu while the country is still going through its war in Gaza, and while the captives are still in Gaza, without him signing a deal, that Netanyahu should not be in Washington speaking to Congress, trying to whitewash his image, trying to spread the lies that he has been spreading. And that's what the protesters and the families of the captives have told us. This evening, they say that he has been sabotaging any attempt to reach a deal, and he has worked so hard at thwarting those attempts to reach a deal to secure the release of captives and bring about an end to the war in Gaza. Maria?
Mohammed, when you speak to the families of the protesters there in Tel Aviv, and excuse me, just to correct myself, you are in Tel Aviv, what do they tell you? How frustrated are they 10 months now into Israel's war on Gaza? And of course, we know that there is such opposition also to this visit, also from the opposition itself. We heard Yair Lapid's speech last week in the Knesset.
They're beyond frustrated, Maria. They're outraged at the Prime Minister. They're accusing him of putting his own political career, his own personal interests ahead of the country and ahead of the captives. They say that he is appeasing the far-right elements within his coalition government, the likes of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and the ultra-nationalist, ultra-Orthodox parties in his government that have warned him that if he signs a deal with Hamas, that they will pull out from his coalition, which will force him to call for early elections. He has been also criticized by the opposition, like you said. The head of the opposition, Yair Lapid, told him last week, if you're not going to go to Washington to announce a deal, that you should not go. This is a bad time for a leader of a country that is going through war to head for another country to speak to its legislative or parliament.
Mohammed, if I may interrupt you, just on that point, why is he there now? Why? And what do people say to you when they maybe ask that question? And how do they respond to why he is there now? What is the point exactly?
Well, we're getting closer to the U.S. elections, and he wants to ensure that he has good communication with whomever wins the presidential elections. And he left thinking that President Biden, will still be going through his campaign, trying to compete for another term at the White House, only to be for President Biden to drop out. Even the presumptive nominee, or the one that is leading the pact from the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, the vice president, elected not to show up today for his speech, but also he wants to connect with the Republicans, with the former President Donald Trump, who seems to be at least competing closely in these elections and doing well in the polls, and he wants to make sure that he has connections to all of them. He knows that if a Republican occupies the White House in come November and in January, that he will get a blank check. And we've heard former President Trump during the first debate, he said that Israel should go all the way to eliminate Hamas from the Gaza Strip, which means more civilian casualties, more destructions in Gaza. And that's exactly what Netanyahu wanted. Netanyahu wants unlimited support from the U.S. He wants to expedite weapon shipments to Israel. He wants to also to focus on Iran, to an issue that appeals to the Americans, especially Americans on the right, the Republicans, and that's why he's there. He has a much friendlier audience there, despite the many who elected not to show up in Congress, despite the mass demonstrations outside Congress. But at least he's speaking to the American legislators who are willing to give him a standing ovation after another. At least since the last time I was keeping a tally, 26 times gave him a standing ovation for someone who is carrying on a war that has killed nearly 40,000 people, the vast majority of them children and women, and that's why he went there. This is not something that he can get by here in Israel. His numbers have dipped so low, historic low, that he will not be able to win any elections, not him and not his Likud party. But again, the accusations here in Israel that he is appeasing to the right within his coalition government, and that's why he is in Washington, to also try to extend his political career and show himself as a statesman during wartime. Maria?
Mohammed, it's such an interesting point you make there on the difference, the juxtaposition of the friendliness of the audiences in Tel Aviv and in Washington right now. For now, thank you so much, Mohammed Al-Qassim, at the protest there in Tel Aviv. All right, let's stay with the protesters and check in with the protesters outside the Capitol building. And if you've just joined us, this is our coverage of the Israeli Prime Minister addressing the US Congress as thousands protest outside the Capitol. Let's look at what's happening there right now with Craig Boswell. And Craig, how is what's been said in the past hour? He's been speaking now for almost an hour, Prime Minister Netanyahu. How has that gone down with the protesters? How have they been reacting?
Right. This address by Netanyahu is not amplified outside on these stages. These demonstrators are not wanting to amplify the message that is being said inside. If I could go back to a point that John has made, and it relates directly to the demonstrators and protesters out here, talking about this being a country, the United States, that typically focuses on domestic issues, doesn't pay attention much to foreign policy. I always kind of take that for granted, that most international audience kind of realize that, but I guess we cannot say this enough, that a foreign policy issue is driving the election campaign in 2024 for the United States presidency. And I asked several people here, several of the demonstrators, especially people from Michigan, and they'll point out that it's not a foreign policy issue, it is a life or death issue. And that is the message. Michigan, of course, one of those key states that has to be won by whatever administration comes in November. President Biden barely took it in 2020. He will need Michigan, his administration, the Vice President Harris, as she now runs for president, she will need Michigan. And Michigan voters are here, and they're watching, and they're listening, and they want to know what Vice President Harris plans to do. They want to know answers to specific questions. How can you push for a ceasefire when you're continuing to arm in the terms of billions of dollars, the Israel support, the Israeli, what they call the Israeli war machine. Now, typically, the United States sends about $3 billion to $4 billion a year. In the past year, it's been $14 billion with these supplementals in Congress. These people are very aware of that. I spoke to some people here. Look, busloads of people have come from across the U.S. I spoke to a group from Georgia. Georgia is a state that President Biden actually won in 2020, barely, remember, by 11,000 votes. That's that infamous phone call from President Trump calling the state attorney general there, saying he just desperately needs to find 11,874 votes, or I think it was pretty specific. So these voters, they're young voters, and they are energized by this issue, by this life or death issue, and this is the driving force of the 2024 election campaign. Where we're standing here on Pennsylvania at the Shut It Down for Palestine stage, they have moved off of this stage now, and they are moving around Washington, D.C., and going through intermittent closures of various intersections. Earlier, they would come to the stage and say, "We've shut down 7th Constitution," and there'd be a cheer from the crowd. And now they're moving towards the National Mall, where much of the demonstrations will take place. That'll be kind of the epicenter of this. One other thing, this will continue across Washington. It'll continue as Netanyahu meets with Vice President Harris tomorrow, as Netanyahu meets with President Biden tomorrow. It's going to continue to the Democratic National Convention. These are the flyers that are being passed out here by organizers of this event here today. It is Stand with Palestine and End U.S. Aid to Israel. This is going to Chicago. This is going to be heard in Chicago, and they're going to continue until they get a response from whatever administration does come into office next January, who's elected, of course, on November 5th. They'll take office in January. So very, very, it's an evolving situation here in Washington, D.C. It is moving around the city, and it will recoalesce on the National Mall. Back to you.
Craig, you raised many interesting points, and that point about Gaza not being just a domestic issue, but now being a foreign policy issue is very important. And we're just seeing Prime Minister Netanyahu leaving the U.S. Congress room right now after delivering what's been close to an hour's speech. And just to quote my colleague, Mohammed Al-Qasim, around 26 standing ovations to the Israeli leader. Just as you're there with us, Craig, and we watch Prime Minister Netanyahu work the room and leave that room after delivering his speech, how has the mood on the street, the issue of Israel's war on Gaza changed over the past 10 months? We've seen so many protests at universities, and today you said buses had been organized, and we understand also there were American Jewish protesters as well. So different facets of people protesting today in Washington.
Exactly, and it has evolved. We were speaking earlier, and I told you that I recognize some faces today that I spoke to back in January when it was a Shut It Down for Palestine march here in Washington, D.C., about 3 blocks just in front of where we are standing now. Spoke to them again, and they are back, reiterating this message, but with much more urgency and much more passion and power behind this voice. More frustrated, I think, is probably the answer to your question. There's a frustration. Look, they call this the 24 hours of rage. They're calling this a day of rage in Washington. It's rage of what's happening, continually happening in Gaza, and rage about a U.S. administration that continues to fund Israel, and they want that to stop. And you mentioned how things have changed. I was at some of those campus protests in New York. I was out in California for one of the campus protests. I was here for the campus protests in Washington. That was a moment that sprung up, and of course now we're in summer, schools aren't in. Likely, if this is not solved, which it doesn't look like it's going to be, likely to reignite once these students come back into colleges. That was one kind of evolution of this. Now we have this this national mobilization of groups here in Washington, D.C., that have now had weeks to plan for this, knowing that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be delivering his fourth address to a joint session of Congress. They really find that quite dismaying. In fact, I just saw on X there was a picture of a lawmaker. I couldn't make out who it was because it's very bright and I couldn't see on my phone, of just someone holding up a sign saying war criminal. House Speaker Mike Johnson really yesterday made kind of this, it was a kind of drastic threat. Really, you don't hear much about these types of events. He said anyone that is disrupting this event will be arrested, talking to really his Democratic members on the other side of the aisle. That is unique in Washington. That doesn't happen very often. The environment around this particular address to a joint session of Congress is far more volatile than any of the other addresses, any of the three other addresses by Benjamin Netanyahu. Even though the one in 2015, it was tense when he was talking about the U.S. beginning to talk with Iran about the nuclear deal. It was the Obama administration at the time. Netanyahu really angered the Obama administration with that address. This time, it looks as though he has a job. He's trying to get in with the Republicans and the GOP. He's going to meet with Donald Trump on Friday, but he also has to, he's got to speak to the Democrats. He's got to speak with the President Biden, the Democrats are in power. Democrats have a slight majority in the Senate. The House is controlled by Republicans, so he is kind of working the politics, while outside it is all about the protests. It is an extraordinary situation taking place here in Washington, D.C., and as these demonstrators that have pointed out, it is life or death, these things that are being talked about inside the halls of Congress. Back to you.
Absolutely, an incredible juxtaposition as we've been watching there. Constant a round of applause, standing ovation for Prime Minister Netanyahu, contrasting to the protests on the streets there in Washington and also Tel Aviv. All right, for now, Craig, thank you very much indeed. Let's take you to TRT-WA's former Gaza reporter and political analyst, Nizar Sadawi, who joins us from TRT-WA's Istanbul studios. Nizar, Prime Minister Netanyahu has spoken. He has given a speech now for an hour. Mohammed al-Qasem said that he had seen counted around 26 standing ovations. What did you make of what was said by Netanyahu?
I was actually more interested in some insinuations or some things that he implied. If I may just read between the lines, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu technically implied that if there is no ceasefire, which he's actually suggesting, saying that Hamas should just handle their weapons and surrender, which he knows will never happen, he's implying for something that we call the civil administration. This is how Gaza was ruled actually before the PA came in power in 1993, before the Oslo Accords. When he says that he needs a civil administration or a civil governance in Gaza by good people in Gaza, people that he sees as good, and keeping some military presence for Israel, he's technically implying that Gaza should remain officially under Israeli occupation, even though he's saying that it could be short-term, not a long-term, not a permanent thing. But still, this is something that Palestinians will never accept. Hamas will technically never accept to surrender or hand over their weapons. This is something, impossible to believe that he would ask Palestinians to do, especially Hamas. So technically, what he's saying is that he's not willing to go for this ceasefire proposal that has been and is still being discussed even behind closed doors and sometimes publicly, whether in Egypt or in Qatar. Egypt and Qatar have been trying to help reach a deal recently. The U.S. itself was involved. This whole proposal came from the U.S. Democratic President Joe Biden, who's about to leave now, and yet Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, stands in the middle of Congress and implies that maybe he wishes to continue and reoccupy Gaza, this time officially, and people, their senators, are actually clapping for him. So I don't think that there is any sort of hope for Palestinians after what has happened today at the US Congress?
Nizar, strong words that you say there. No hope for Palestinians after what's been said there at the US Congress. Thank you so much for now. Nizar Sadawi, thank you. All right, let's take you back now to Washington and speak to our reporter, John Brain, who's at the US Capitol for us. John, the speech has ended, an hour-long speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu to the US Congress, his fourth. What do you make of what's been said, and how would you describe the audience that he had? A point that Mohammed Al-Qasem said was this is a very friendly audience compared to the one that he would get back home.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it is an article of faith in the US Congress that you support Israel. And you have to see this as a symbolic support for the nation of Israel rather than necessarily 100% support for Netanyahu himself. Because, of course, there's a lot of criticism of him here in Washington for the way he's conducted the war in Gaza. But certainly, yes, a very good reception for him. Though, of course, there were empty seats. Many Democrat lawmakers stayed away, most notably the Vice President Kamala Harris, who said she had a previous engagement. She would normally be expected to preside over an occasion like this. And, well, we'll discuss in a minute what her absence means. But it was notable that he brought much of the speech round to Iran. He wants to bring America and Israel close in the sense that they have a shared enemy in Iran and what Netanyahu described as an axis of terrorism because of the proxies that Iran has. Well, let's discuss this further with Nizar Fazak, a political analyst and an expert on these affairs. What did you make of it?
Definitely there was intention to make Netanyahu make himself look like the ally that's staunch, that's the fighter, the warrior. But importantly, he wanted to make it look like he's doing this on behalf of the West, and he's summoning the West to fight with him, and that there is a fight between evil and good, and the civilized and uncivilized, which of course is one way to try to change the narrative around the fact that it is his failure that this happened. After all, not only did this happen on his watch, but more importantly, him and the Likud in general, they are the ones with the philosophy of we don't need to talk to the Palestinians, we can skip them, we can talk to everybody else. And October 7th blew that out of the water.
And so what about this idea of America and Israel have a common enemy? He talked about, you mentioned civilization, that it's not a clash of civilizations, it's a clash between civilization and barbarism.
Correct. So he's trying to preempt the criticism. It's interesting that he mentioned that there were protesters outside and that some of them are actually Jewish.
Iran's useful enemies.
Exactly, and that they're useful idiots, right? Because he's trying to upend them and show that they are at least naive or ignorant of what's happening, and that he has the authority to speak about what's happening, and he speaks for the Jews, and he knows what is the best strategy to protect them, when in fact, again, what happened on October 7th was a great failure in protecting the Israelis. And that's the big quagmire that he's in, that after 75 years of existence, this is the first time where Israelis genuinely believe that they do not know how to protect themselves, which is different from they haven't been able to protect themselves. The level of surprise at how much the Palestinian resistance was prepared is what scared the Israelis, because they realized that they do not know their enemy. And that's a very scary place to be, so he's trying to distract from all of that.
Now, we mentioned the empty seats. There were quite a few lawmakers didn't turn up, but one particularly important absentee, Kamala Harris, who's now, of course, likely or almost certain to be the Democratic candidate. She could be the president in January if Netanyahu is still in power, which, of course, is debatable. He'll have to deal with her. How concerned will he be that she didn't turn up?
I don't think he'll be very concerned. It's clear that he's put all of his eggs in the Republican basket. He's counting on Trump to win. And in fact, I think part of his trip here is to basically kiss the ring of Trump to try to curry favor, because Trump said that Netanyahu is not conducting the war well and he doesn't like losers. So there is all of that he needs to work on. As far as the Democrats, the fear for the Democratic establishment is that they have been hemorrhaging support because of the war and how the Biden administration hasn't been doing enough to protect Palestinian civilians, and therefore the Democrats needed to show a very clear message that they disagree with this Israeli prime minister. They support Israel, they support Israel's right to defend itself, but they disagree with this prime minister and believe, in fact, he's harming Israel and harming the Israelis.
And in terms, he said he'd unveil a plan for the day after the war. He didn't really have anything new to say that we haven't heard before, did he?
No, exactly. And that's the thing, that he's using this vague terms, talking about generalities, that we're going to finish the war, we're going to rebuild Gaza, we're going to get he mentioned that he's going to get Gaza to have to be run by Palestinians who do not want to destroy Israel, but he doesn't get into the specifics and the fact that the Palestinians have to decide who rules Gaza. It's not up to him to decide who rules Gaza.
Okay, Nizar, thank you very much indeed. Well, I think we've lost contact with you in the studio, so I'll hand back, but there'll be more from Washington in the next hour.
Thank you so much, John Brain, and also to your guest there, Nizar Farsakh, for your analysis of Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech there to Congress, which lasted an hour and finished in the past 20 minutes. All right.